So I had a recent conversation on this show. Maybe you seen it, maybe you didn't it. It was about voter fraud because Bernie Sanders tweeted this out a little while ago. When was this? I don't know what the date is on it. I cut it off. It looks like August 4th. It could have been August 4th. He tweeted this out. He said, anybody claiming there is widespread voter fraud, trying to suppress the vote, trying to keep people from voting is a political coward. And I was like, hey, why you being... I thought there was voter fraud. I thought they were surprised. I thought Hillary did. I thought all that. I thought they did do it to you. I thought... And so I got it wrong. I got it wrong because he's talking about voter fraud. So when... Well, let me just... voter fraud is an illegitimate vote by persons misrepresenting themselves, right? So that's, Republicans keep passing these laws where you have to have a voter ID to vote because of voter fraud, because somebody's going to vote twice or vote when they shouldn't be voting. So that's what he's talking about. That never happens. There's almost, I never... So that's the kind of voter fraud that doesn't happen. The kind of voter fraud that does happen is when they pass restrictive voting laws. Well, let me just read what I wrote here, and then we'll figure it out. So after the repeal of the Voting Rights Act, which they repealed, the Supreme Court repealed the Voting Rights Act, right? And let's remember why they put the Voting Rights Act in the 60s was to make sure that states that were racist against black people would have an oversight by the federal government to make sure that their elections were not discriminatory, because they were discriminatory before. And guess what? As soon as the Supreme Court took that away, they got rid of it, the Voting Rights Act, they started passing all these laws to suppress the vote. And that's what Bernie Sanders was talking about. He's not talking about the other stuff. So in many Republican states, they have used voter ID laws to deny the right to vote to seniors, students, and low-income voters. Even the most partisan organizations agree that voter fraud is practically non-existent. On the other hand, election fraud, now that's different.
Oh.
Election fraud is not counting the votes. Different. Voter fraud, different than election fraud. What does election fraud include? Voter disenfranchisement. That's a nice word. Disenfranchisement. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. Voter disenfranchisement. That's the longest word in the English.
Nailed it.
Thank you. Voter disenfranchisement, when you are not on the voting rolls. So there's that kind. So when you show up, you're supposed to be on the voting roll, and you're not. You've been scrubbed. That's election fraud. Voter purges. Voter tampering, meaning when the party or state changes your party affiliation. That's voter. This is all election fraud. Voter suppression includes cutting of polling locations or giving false information to voters. That's also election fraud. And a rigged election, that's rigging the process to predetermine the outcome. For example, a party's preferential treatment and coordination with one candidate over another, kind of like what the DNC did this past election with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. How Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the DNC colluded, were in cahoots with the Hillary campaign and to screw over Bernie Sanders. That's another form of election fraud. Or using undemocratic mechanisms like superdelegates. In this year's Democratic primary, there were over 700 superdelegates. That's more delegates than the largest state in the country. Superdelegates are used to prevent insurgent candidates who don't get approval from the party hierarchy. And if you don't believe that, watch the video where former DNC chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz explains it. Election fraud is a state or party using any excuse not to count the votes. That's also election fraud. The Democratic Party couldn't have been more brazen about preferential handling of the primary. By the way, this was happening to Democratic Party voters, and the party didn't even pretend to care. And after the revelations of WikiLeaks, nobody can say the Democratic Party acted in good faith. It's horrible when Republicans do it, but it's okay when Democrats do it, I guess. In recent Democratic primaries, we can't say for sure who won, but we do know there was voter purges, over 100,000 in New York State alone, There was limiting of voting poll stations from Arizona to Rhode Island, drastic cutting of polling locations. Those unpredictable and undemocratic superdelegates who voted against the candidate chosen by the voters, the superdelegates are supposed to represent. That happened. That the superdelegates voted against the candidate chosen by the voters that the superdelegates are supposed to represent. Also, thousands of voters report that machines were flipping their votes. And there was also reports of ballot tampering, where election officials altered the ballots being counted. The massive issuing of provisional ballots instead of crossover ballots in states like California and New Jersey. Why should anyone care about this? Because these primary elections are run by the parties, but we, the taxpayers, pay for them. And this year, we're really paying for them. And that brings us to the fact that exit polling has been astronomically off. If an exit poll is more than 8 points off, that is considered an investigation trigger. If an exit poll differs from 10 to 20 points, we have a stolen election. Exit polls are not used to predict results. Exit polls are used to audit or verify official vote counts. In over 20 states, we've seen exit polls discrepancy margins in the hundreds of thousands. And people are right to ask questions. So that's what I have to say about election fraud. The difference between voter fraud and election fraud is very big. There was election fraud in this primary, and that's what Bernie wasn't talking about. He was talking about what the Republicans are doing by suppressing the vote, claiming there's voter fraud. So I'm glad to clear that up.
That's an important thing. I think one last thing that we need to mention, too, when we're talking election fraud, I mean, let's say hypothetically here that there's a corporate-run media that maybe wants to grossly misrepresent the lead one candidate has over the other because that candidate will play the game better for them. That is also election fraud.
That is also election fraud. Okay. All right. So thank you, Ron Placone. Thank you, Bernie. And thank you for giving me the heads up so I could clarify this.